Critique of the Syrio-Aramaic reading of the Qur'an. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The work of Christoph Luxemburg has been one of the most controversial books, and his arguments are recurring in the Islamic-Christian dialogue. It has at its core the objective of proving that the Qur'an was corrupted, warped, and not preserved. It also attacks the foundations of Islam, that is, the Isnad system and our living oral tradition. In this series, we will present answers to the claims of Christoph Luxemburg conclusively and comprehensively, starting by the method presented by Christoph Luxemburg himself to find the Syrio-Aramaic Qur'an. The method of Christoph Luxemburg. Luxemburg's whole theory is based on passages and verses of the Quran he calls quote-unquote dark passages. These are passages that read independently of the narrations, are simply not understood and do not make any sense at all. After judging that they are dark passages, he then proceeds to find the Syrio-Aramaic origin of its words following this method. A. Check with the tafsir. I quote, "The aim of this work was in the first place to clarify the passages designated in Western Quranic studies as obscure. However, apart from the previously mentioned unrecognized Aramaisms, the investigation of the overall Quranic language, which is considered to be indisputably Arabic, has uncovered, so to speak, as a byproduct, a goodly number of non-insignificant misreadings and misinterpretations, even of genuinely Arabic expressions. Precisely in relation to the latter, it has turned out again and again the meaning accepted by the Arabic commentators of the Quran has not fit at all in the context." B. Check in Lisan al-Arab, the Arabic lexicon he had access to. I quote, "Starting from the understanding that the Arabic readers, in view of the fact that the basic form of the earlier Quranic manuscript is not easy to decipher, even for educated Arabs, have for the most part correctly read today's accepted version of the Quran. This version is fundamentally respected in the forthcoming textual analysis following the principle of lectio difficilia. Only in those instances in which the context is obviously unclear, in which the Arabic commentators of the Quran are at the limit of their Arabic, in which it is said over and over again in Tabari, اختلف أهل التأويل في ذلك, the commentators disagree on the interpretation. Or not infrequently when the listing of a series of speculations both in Tabari and the Lisan concluded with the remark Wallahu a'lam, God knows best, or in plain English, God only knows what the expression in question really means. Only then will the attempt be made, while paying careful attention to the given context to discover a more reasonable reading." Page 23. C. Check if there's a homonym, i.e. an etymologically related root, in Aramaic with a different meaning. I quote, "A check is made to see whether there is a homonym root in Syrio-Aramaic whose meaning differs from that of the Arabic and which, based on a consideration of objective criteria, clearly fits better in the context. In a not insignificant number of cases, this Syrio-Aramaic reading produced the better sense. Here one must see to it that according to the context, the two homonyms can occur both in the Arabic and in the Syrio-Aramaic meaning." D. Try different diacritics. I quote, "An attempt is made in the first place to read the Arabic writing differently than in the Cairo version of the Quran by changing the diacritical points, which were not there originally and which were later and perhaps erroneously added. Not infrequently it can be determined that the Arabic readers have apparently falsely read an expression in itself genuinely Arabic because they lack the appropriate background information." E1. Check for an Aramaic root using different diacritics. I quote, "The attempt is made while changing the diacritical points to make out an Aramaic root beneath the Arabic writing. In an almost incalculable number of cases this has been successful to the extent that the Aramaic expression has given the context a decidedly more logical sense." E2. Try to retranslate presumably Arabic words by inferring the semantics of the Syrio-Aramaic word. I quote, "A final attempt is made to reconstruct the actual meaning of the apparently genuine Arabic expression by translating it back into Aramaic by way of the semantics of the Syrio-Aramaic expression. This attempt exceeds in importance, extent, and level of difficulty the discovery of actual Aramaisms, for as there will be still no Arabic-Aramaic dictionaries, the researcher must here depend solely on his or her own knowledge of the language. In the process, what appears to be genuinely Arabic expressions can be divided into two. 1. Loan formations, and 2. Loan translations, or what we call calques. F. Try to find lost meanings of Arabic words by looking at 10th century Syrio-Aramaic lexicons. I quote, "Another category involves, in turn, those for the most part genuine Arabic expressions that are neither susceptible to plausible explanation in the lisan, nor explainable by translation back into Syrio-Aramaic, either because they have a completely different meaning in modern Arabic, or because their basic Arabic meaning is simply unknown. In such cases, the important lexical works by the Eastern Syrian physicians Ibn Ali and Ibn al-Bahlul occasionally provide information on their real meanings. These Syrio-Aramaic lexicons were created in the 10th century, presumably as a translating aid for the Syrian translators of Syriac scientific works into Arabic, as Syrio-Aramaic was being displaced more and more by Arabic at the time. The Syrio-Aramaic Arabic dictionary of Manna mentioned at the outset by taking into account the works of Ibn al-Bahlul continues this tradition of Eastern Syriac lexicography to a certain extent. The Arabic vocabulary that these lexicons employ for the explanation of Syrio-Aramaic words and expressions is of eminent importance here, especially when as an equivalent of Syrio-Aramaic expression. Several Arabic synonyms are listed, of which one or the other occasionally occurs in the Qur'an. In this respect, the Thesaurus Syriacus has proven to be a veritable treasure trove whenever it cites, although irregularly, at least relatively often, the Arabic explanations of the Eastern Syrian lexicographers. In this way, it has been possible, thanks to the Thesaurus Syriacus, to explain many an obscure Quranic expression. A systematic exploration of the Arabic vocabulary in these early Eastern Syriac lexicons, however, would bring even more to light. Also, the early Christian Arabic literature of the Eastern Syrians that is until now ignored by Quran scholars, yet whose Arabic vocabulary reaches back in part at least to the pre-Islamic usage of the Christian Arabs of Mesopotamia and Syria, would lead to more convincing results than the so-called Old Arabic, though for the most part post-Quranic poetry, whose vocabulary is extremely inappropriate and misleading for understanding the Quran. Critique of the method and key assumptions. Luxemburg has certain major assumptions which underpin his work. The following critiques will be levied against him as a rebuttal. 1. Adequate oral tradition. His Syriac theory assumes the first and second generation Muslims were fundamentally disconnected, going from a Syriac Christian hymn prayer book to a widespread acceptance of an Arabic tradition. I will primarily use Marjan van Puten's The Grace of God as evidence for a written Uthmanic archetype, and Michael Cook's The Stemma of Regional Codices of the Quran to show that there was early Arabic codification that was widespread and stable. 2. The Quran is not strictly working with a Syrio-Aramaic framework. Many words, especially those involved in a Christian context, have Ethiopic borrowings, or if from Aramaic, it takes from strands that are not Syriac. Here's a summary of Michael Cook's conclusions, which show 1. There was a common stemma that codices in Kufa, Basra, and Damascus and Medina used. 2. Medieval Muslim scholars did not have a concept of stematics, and thus this is a genuine transmission from an archetype. This shows the overall reliability of the Muslim reports. Here's a summary of the argument. Muslim sources indicate that there were 4 regional codices sent by Uthman for codification. These were in Kufa, Basra, Syria, and Medina. Cook shows that the Muslim reports for the variants all lead to the lack of any serious contamination between texts. To fabricate sets of variants that are free of the appearance of cross-regional contamination, Muslim scholars from all regions across the Muslim world would have to understand the mechanics of textual transmission from the logic of stemma to contamination, which is impossible given that this study was introduced merely centuries ago. Van Putten summarizes Cook's argument and conclusion. I quote, "These patterns that Cook has analyzed clearly indicate that the transmission and introduction of these variants point to only about 7 different possible stemmata, and that they agree with the account of the transmission of the text given by the standard Muslim historians. As medieval Muslim scholars had no concept of stemmatics, the very fact that such pattern arises leads Cook to conclude that, I quote, we have to do with genuine transmission from an archetype, end quote. As further proof of this conclusion, Yasin Dutton in 2001 and 2004 analyzed 2 early Hijazi Quranic manuscripts, which show all the variants of the Syrian Mus'haf, but none attributed to the other Mus'hafs as reported by Al-Dani, meaning that this archetype must be very clearly while being confirmable through the manuscript tradition. Van Putten goes in depth over what he calls orthographic idiosyncrasies. The Quranic Rasim reflects that of pre-classical orthography in that certain words can be spelled out with more freedom. A simple example is the phrase ni'ma, which will be studied shows that it can be spelled in 2 different ways. These are functionally the same and have no difference in meaning, while in Quranic orthography, feminine nouns in construct are usually written with the final ta' marbuta, as is the case in classical orthography. A rather large proportion, about 22% of the feminine constructs are written with ta' maftuha instead. For some common phrases, the distribution between these 2 forms is almost equal, and for some lexical items, ta' maftuha is the only attested spelling. The items where the 2 forms are equally predominant are a particularly good place to show that the orthographic idiosyncrasies are consistently reproduced. For if the manuscripts did not have a written Uthmanic exemplar in Arabic, they would not be able to reproduce these orthographic idiosyncrasies consistently in the manner that they do. As part of our analysis, we must look at the Quranic use of the word ni'mah. This certainly is not a distinctive word. It occurs 23 times in the Quran, 11 times with the ta' marbuta spelling and 12 times with the ta' maftuha spelling. Thus, an analysis of early manuscripts on specific verses should show a convergence on usage if there was a written exemplar. The table presented here is a visual description of this phenomena. The page of manuscript K, including Quran chapter 2 verse 231, is written by a much later hand and thus cannot be used for this present analysis. We notice a clear convergence across every manuscript in every Quranic verse, with only four manuscripts noting the fact that one is quite late, diverging and all on the same verse. We see this same pattern with a number of other words such as al-mala, which is normally spelled al-mala with an alif, but is also spelled al-mala with a waw in four verses of the Quran. Every single early Quranic manuscript is consistent in spelling it in the way in those four instances, even though there is no functional difference and they all belong to different regions. Simply, this data is an indication that from early on, the Uthmanic archetype of Muslim tradition was spread far and across the Muslim world. Cook's study has indicated that the reports on different codices cannot be simply laid or fabrications retrojected onto the text and are all linked to the real Uthmanic archetypes, with the manuscript tradition itself later confirming this. Van Puten's study has succinctly strengthened this idea. The Arabic rasm itself was widespread from an authoritative source early on, indicating that the relative trustworthiness of the traditional Islamic account on this detail. This leaves no room for a Syrio-Aramaic Qur'an, whether in full or in part. As it has been demonstrated, the Uthmanic foundation is stable, and the only non-Uthmanic manuscript is still clearly Arabic and corresponds with our Qur'an. The third argument to be presented is the Qur'an's use of non-Syriac loanwords, especially when it discusses items pertaining to the Christian stories. For if the Quran was partly composed of Syriac hymns, we would expect it to reflect in the borrowings at the very bare minimum. Borrowings from the Ethiopian Ge'ez and non-Syriac Aramaic will be listed, and the impact on Luxemburg's thesis will be briefly discussed. Languages constantly evolve, and as part of that evolution, dialects and languages in specific areas will take from surrounding languages. An example would be the word beef. While it is recognized as an English word, the origins come from the old French word boeuf. If the Quran were a Christian Syriac text, we'd expect it to replete with Syriac loanwords, especially when it comes to biblical subjects and motifs. However, what we see is the exact opposite. A brief list is as follows. While yes, Aramaic loanwords do exist in the Quran, as is expected from a Hijazi milieu, the linguist Van Putten clearly explains that the Aramaic variety that influenced Quranic and pre-classical Arabic had not undergone the famous lenition of post-vocalic simple stops, nor had it lost short vowels and open syllables. This necessarily means that the form of Aramaic that influenced Quranic and classical Arabic, even the religious vocabulary, cannot be Syriac, which almost certainly underwent both shifts before becoming a dominant religious language. Classical Syriac itself, as an important vehicular language of Christianity, only emerges in the 4th century CE, well after these developments have taken place. The Aramaic loanwords of the Quran often come up in an unspirantized form. The following examples come up: Malakut, which means kingdom; Malik, which means king; or Masjid, which means place of worship. Even the proper names of biblical figures have a markedly un-Syriac form, like the word Zakaria. We have thus provided ample proof that the Quran's loanwords are not simply Syriac, and thus it cannot be viewed as a Syriac text. It uses non-Syriac Aramaic and Ge'ez specifically in a Christian and Jewish context. Thus it would make no sense for it to be part of a Syriac work. Doing so also goes against the proven notion of a stable Quranic text, which was previously demonstrated. Auxiliary grapes or ladies of heaven. وَزَوَّجْنَاكُمْ حُورٍ عِينٍ. Quran 44 verse 54. The traditional interpretation of this verse is that it means that the believers will be paired with white maidens, hur, and they have big eyes, ain, although there are discussions on the real meaning of these two words. It could be argued that them being white here does not refer to their skin, but a remark to their purity and faithfulness, as a word of this root was also used for the disciples of Jesus, Hawariyun, in Quran chapter 61 verse 41. Ain is the plural of ayan, and it could mean honorable or noble, as this word was used for nobles and men of good heritage. Even with the literal meaning taken, it's not entirely nonsensical, as the Arabs considered the white skin a higher standard of beauty, as they sold white Byzantine slaves for higher prices. And in poetry, big eyes are also a standard of beauty, as the poets liken their women to those with big eyes. Luxemburg seems to have falsely understood whiteness to be about their eyes and not the virgins themselves. The fact that it is talking about women is concluded from the phrase, the believers will be paired. as the pair of men in Arabic language and Quranic usage in other verses. For example, indeed, Allah has heard the argument of the woman who pleaded with you concerning her pair. Thus, since the end of the word used for they will be paired is a wajnahum, the letter meme, which denotes a male plural. One of the prerequisites that Luxemburg applies on his own methodology is that he can't apply it until a certain phrase or word can't be understood in Arabic. However, we have clearly demonstrated that it can be understood in Arabic in a way that is consistent and coherent with Arabic grammar and Quranic Arabic terminology. Luxemburg argues this in regards to the mosaics of grapes in the Temple Mount. However, the idea that they're suggesting that grapes are fruits of heaven is found clearly in other verses, such as, "And we have placed in it gardens of palm trees and grapevines, and caused springs to gush forth in it." Quran chapter 36, verse 34. The mosaics in the Temple Mount have palm trees and grapevines, therefore it's clearly inspired by this verse. Ending remarks from real academics. We do not know who Luxemburg is and thus cannot gauge his credentials ourselves. What we can do, however, is compare his findings to other academics in the field. We will be using Stephen Wild to keep it brief. Dr. Stephen Wild is a leading scholar in Oriental studies, the Qur'an, Arabic lexicography, classical and modern Arabic literature. He is also the only modern Western scholar in the field of Oriental studies to be invited to Medina to participate in a scholarly debate about the Qur'an. According to Stephen Wild, Luxemburg's arguments are based on conjecture and lack support from available evidence, plus proposing a new understanding of the Arabic language used in the Qur'an, which Wild convincingly argues does not adhere to the rules of Arabic or Aramaic morphology and syntax. Wild also criticizes Luxemburg's method of transposing Syriac into Arabic text and allowing for misunderstandings, misreadings, and mistakes, which he suggests generates more interpretations while reducing the criteria to decide between them. Additionally, Wild argues that Luxemburg's interpretations of Quranic passages are far-fetched and not supported by historical or linguistic evidence. For one, Luxemburg's method of unlocking the door of imaginable Arabic readings for the Quranic letters leads to an almost limitless number of possible interpretations. The different readings of the Quranic letters demand different contexts, making it very difficult to decide which reading is correct without proper context, of which Luxemburg strips away using his methodology. 2. Luxemburg's view that the whole context is open to radical questioning leaves practically no context to be trusted anyway. He argues that the mixed Arabo-Aramaic language of the pre-Quran that he postulates adheres neither to the rules of Arabic nor to those of Aramaic morphology and syntax, which generates even further variance. Unlike Luxemburg, we ground our Quranic Arabic in history and can trace the development of the Arabic language in the Hijazi milieu to inform our views. This has been partially demonstrated in Van Puten's work referenced above. 3. Once Luxemburg is satisfied that the hitherto accepted meaning of the expression hur ain has to be abandoned, other female inhabitants of paradise rapidly disappear. Luxemburg's interpretation of qasirat al-tarf, restraining their glances, Quran chapter 37 verse 49, as low-hanging fruits, and azwaj mutahara, pure spouses, chapter 225, as all kinds of clean fruit, are a result of his method of interpretation, which Wilde criticizes as disregarding the traditional meanings of the words. Luxemburg has to reinterpret key words and accepted definitions to fit into his definition. This looks more like he's fitting the evidence into a predetermined conclusion rather than evaluating the data holistically to come to an honest academic conclusion. Wilde rightfully criticizes Luxemburg for his triumphalism in claiming that the Quranic statement that there is no more than eating and drinking in paradise is essentially clear and excludes all imaginary ideas. And lastly, his tendency to read his own moral and religious beliefs into the text, rather than letting the text speak for itself. The assertion that the Quran's description of heavenly maids are actually referring to grapes, which he sees as a misreading of the text, and a reflection of Victorian era prejudices, as Wilde would argue. His rejection of the idea of houris and immortal youths in paradise, which the author sees as an attempt to impose a particular moral view on the text, rather than a valid philological argument.
الله